Okay. I think we'll get started, despite the fact that we're a minute early. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Think and Drink. I am so happy to see you all here. For those who don't know, Think and Drinks are a free monthly speaker series that happens on the first Thursday evening of every month. This talk is going to be our last talk in our theme of the year, which is Great Women of the Great Lakes and Beyond. I am very, very excited to announce that next year's theme is going to be ice. So stories frozen in time. We've got some pretty cool things lined up. But tonight we are going to be talking with Lori Whitmire about women on submarines. Before I let Lori start, I have just one thing, which is if anyone has their phones on them, please silence them. We want to make sure that we have as great of a presentation as possible. Do that. And then the other thing is, if you guys enjoy this program and want to see more like them, please consider becoming a member and supporting the museum. That support really allows us to continue to have these programs be free and available both in person and online. So we really appreciate it. And with that, I think we're going to have let Lori go. So Lori.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be with you this evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to apologize up front a little bit. If you see me kind of moving around, I have a very anxious pup that's in the office with me. And typically when I'm gone all day, she likes to hang out with me in the evenings. So as Colin said, my name is Lori Whitmire. In my official capacity, I am a fleet historian at the Naval History and Heritage Command on the historic Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. I am really grateful for this opportunity to be with you this evening, and I hope that we can have a really good conversation about one of my very favorite topics, and that is women in the submarine community. This topic is near and dear to my heart for several reasons, and which I'll go in and explain as we move along. Okay, so just to start this off, in a previous life, I was active duty in a career field that is adjacent to the very topic that we're going to be talking about tonight. So everyone ready to have a conversation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to start off with giving you a little bit of background about women in the Navy. For folks like myself and the women serving today, we have stood on the shoulders of so many great women who have come before us, right? And they have built a long, very wonderful legacy that we are privileged and honored to continue. Women in the Navy began in 1908 and the Navy Nursing Corps, of course, which became home to the Sacred 20. And in World War II, we see the birth of the waves, right? Women's auxiliary units in the military across the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Navy were created essentially in a larger capacity to help free a man for the fight. Typically, women were aboard shore installations in a various range of activities, but you did see women in what we now refer to as combat units. And one of the things specifically that I'd like to bring out in talking about this is looking back to World War II, even though women were barred from a lot of the vast majority of combat units, that couldn't be the same said for the nursing corps. And a matter of fact, one of the only women to ever really be significantly honored by the United States Navy was a nurse who was able to escape when Bataan and Corregidor fell in the Philippines. Currently, the Navy is only second behind the Air Force with a number of women who are serving on active duty. Women now make up a little bit over 20% of naval forces. While there are no female special warfares, i.e. SEALs, we do have a young female who passed the qualifications for the special warfare craft, which is called SWIC. So she is a SWIC boat captain. It is very significant that we're talking about this, particularly with the upcoming builds of the new Columbia-class submarines. And I am really excited to see what the Navy has done over the course of my life. This has been a really significant shift from the time that I was 18 years old and joined the Navy in 1988. I'm getting on up there. I'm a little old these days. And it has given me really great, just a significant amount of pride to see that in 2014, Admiral Michelle Howard was the first female four-star in the Navy. She became the first female four-star African-American across all the service branches. And in 2023, Admiral Franchetti was certified or confirmed by the Senate to become the first female CNO and the first female member of the JCS. Admiral Franchetti earned her position. She is an absolute wonderful example of leadership, and given her new NAV plan, she really is looking to take the Navy, building on the past successes of her predecessors and moving the Navy forward. I want to also talk about, too, that in 2023, one of the most significant things I think that we saw, given the fact that we're going to be talking a little bit about the risk rule and what that entailed for the military, but more specifically for the Navy. In 2023, we celebrated 50 years of women in naval aviation. So let's roll the clock back a little bit and talk about why these time periods, particularly beginning in 2010, this was a very significant thing, not just for the Navy, but across the DoD. Even after World War II, it emerges really after World War II, we see this policy emerge called the Combat Exclusion Policy. Is everyone familiar with this?
No.
Okay. So under the policy, women were not allowed to be assigned to units that had the potential or were engaged in the possibility of having direct enemy fire. This really significantly eliminated a lot of job opportunities that women would be able to fill, billets that women would be able to fill across all branches of service. In 1993, April 1993, the risk rule, as the Combat Exclusion Policy came to be known as, was rescinded a little bit because it allowed for females to become aviators. More specifically, they would be able to engage. However, there was still the remainder of the risk rule continued to be put into place and held in place, that outside the aviation field, women could not be in any combat positions or in combat adjacent positions. So I'm going to use the medical field as an example for this. Now, I just talked about the Sacred 20, right? And how the Navy Nursing Corps was the very first female unit, women's unit in the Navy. So everybody's really familiar. I'm about to show my age here with the show MASH, right? Let's raise a hand. Have a TV show MASH, right? Now, we know in MASH, right, there were female nurses in those Army MASH units, correct? Yeah. So what happens when the risk rule is that would not really have been possible, because even though those MASH units were separate and back from the battlefield, and they did actually treat combat casualties, those nurses were not allowed to go forward to the battlefield. So, which is funny because those MASH units would come under fire, correct? And that's the way those show, but they were not allowed to be up at the front line. Okay. That began to change slowly but surely. In 2011, there was a commission convened that began to review the policy as folks began to really make the very salient argument that by eliminating these hundreds of thousands of billets that women would be able to fill, that it hindered the ability of women to have serious promotion potential. In 2012, February of 2012 to be specific, the Pentagon began to review these restrictions, and under the direction of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2013, they made the recommendation and the ban was lifted. So when the risk rule, this combat exclusion policy, goes away. with the exception, again, that women could not be assigned to specialized occupational specialties, very specialized units, i.e., SEALs, Rangers, and other teams like them. Now, we have began to see that shift being moved in that direction where women are now moving into these communities. We have seen female Rangers be able to pass Ranger school. But here's the key factor in all of this. In these combat positions, which submarines were included in initially, is the fact that you have to be able to pass the standards. And I think that that is something that we need to keep in mind as we move forward, is the fact that the women who were the groundbreakers in this were not asking for special favors. And they have done a lot to contribute to the ability of women to move into these more specialized units like submarines and demonstrate that they're not separate and apart from their counterparts, and they just want to be considered sailors and submariners. The Navy, ironically enough, was a little bit forward thinking in thinking about what the risk rule meant to its female sailors. The ban on women in submarines was lifted in 2010. Initially, there were 24 women selected, all officers. There would be 3 aboard each type of SSGN or SSBNs. There were two subs in each class where these women would be assigned to. For the SSBNs, we're going to see the I just had a moment. The Maine and the Wyoming. Sorry about that. And eventually in 2013, the Los Angeles class fast attacks and the new fast attack submarines were open to women as well. Now, can anybody tell me why the first initial boats to be converted and integrated with women, why it was the SSGNs and the SSBNs? More room, yes. And it was easier actually to allocate space for that integration because those boats are bigger. For those of you who know, the SSGNs that we currently have in our fleet are converted SSBNs. So since that time, we've had some very significant, firsts in this career field. We have in 2011, as I said, the first women on the Ohio ballistic missile submarines. In 2012, one of your very own, Lieutenant Britta Christensen, became the first supply officer to earn her dolphins. In 2016, Chief Petty Officer Dominique Sabator became the first enlisted woman to pass her submarine qualifications. In 2022, Sonar Tech Master Chief Angela Kogler became the first female chief of the boat. This was a thing that made my heart sing. As a former enlisted sailor, that made my heart sing. And in 2022, Lieutenant Commander Amber Cohen became the first executive officer of the USS Kentucky. So currently, almost half of the submarine wardrooms, I am proud to say, are female. And the commanders initially were, even though there was a little hesitation, right? What they have found is that with the female submariners, and this is across the career fields, but they found that they brought a new way of thinking a little bit outside the box to what they were doing. And they were so committed to this career field because for so long they understood that this was not, and I'm going to say the word, a privilege that was afforded to them. And it was just this moment to where in a world that some of us had lived in for the better parts of our lives, the moment that this occurs, it's like this joyous momentum, right? Like this is a new thing. And how long is it going to be before we continue punching through these glass ceilings? So all of this is built upon the work that the WIS task force, the Women in Submarines task force that was stood up in 2009, really pushed forward. The idea of why we get the first women aboard submarines is because they were officers. And the thought process is we get the female O's aboard the submarines, right? get them integrated, get them doing their jobs. And then for the enlisted folks who come on board the subs in 2016, those female officers could serve as mentors and as role models. And that frame of thought absolutely has paid off. Absolutely has paid off. The USS New Jersey, as you folks may know, was the first submarine specifically designed with women in mind for the integrated crew. And whenever she was commissioned, it was the irony of that is it came on the 105th anniversary of women being able to serve in the Navy. So the whole way that the Navy has moved forward with women in submarines is indicative not only of the forward thinking by the Pentagon, by military leadership, by Navy leadership, right? It's also to demonstrate that we have an exemplary amount of very well qualified individuals who are willing to put on a uniform and serve at a time and place when less than, I think roughly the latest standard that I saw was 0.5% of our national population wants to serve in the military. To have women be able to be into jobs like being on board submarines is a very significant achievement. Now I'm going to go back and tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm so passionate about this. In 1988, when I joined the Navy, women were barred from combat ships. We could serve aboard supply ships and ships that were not going to be anywhere near an actual engagement. For those of you who are familiar with naval warfare, not really sure what the thought process behind this is, because when you're on the open seas, any ship is a target, right? So a lot of us felt like we were really confined in the career fields that we were able to choose. So when I joined the Navy, I actually joined the Navy as undesignated. And when I went to boot camp at Orlando, I got reclassified. So they came to me and they said, we have 3 jobs available for you. One of them is IS. And I thought, intelligence specialist. I'm not really sure I like that idea. To me, sometimes it's just a little bit of a contradiction of terms. And they were like, okay, so the other one is OS. And I'm like, no, operations specialist. I'm not sure about that either. So the third one was a job called an ocean systems technician analyst. And so I asked the detailer, I said, "Ooh, that sounds cool. Like, what is that?" And he said, well, an OT basically goes out and plays with dolphins and whales. And you work a little bit on learning how, you're trying to figure out how they speak and how we can communicate. Because at that point in time, we were using dolphins and other sea mammals, right? And I'm thinking, oh, that's a job for me, right? I am all about that. So I go to Norfolk and I'm like, Norfolk, why am I going to Norfolk, right? So I would think I went to Key West, right? Someplace really cool where I'd be out there playing with some sea creatures. So I go to Norfolk and I go to A school. And then my job description that I was told when I was in boot camp that I would be playing with sea creatures turned out that I wasn't going to be playing with sea creatures. I would be hunting them. And not the mammal kind, the big, long, steel-hulled ones. So when I joined the Navy in about 88, by 1989, I was in a submarine adjacent community. My job was one that when the OT community was stood up in the late 1950s, early 1960s, women were included in those early proponents of what would become known as the sonar technician field. And so they took this group of sonar techs out and they said, hey, we're thinking about doing this new thing. And for the sake of just being really careful about the community, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. I hope you folks can understand. So they said, hey, we got this new specialized thing. You guys want to try this out? And they're like, sure. Yeah, this is great. So as it turns out, we became a community that was dedicated to the purpose of hunting Soviet submarines. That was our job. So that community continued until the rate was disestablished in 1997. and incorporated back into the sonar tech community. In 1990 and then late 1980s, the OT community, along with a community known as the Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, SURTAS ships, were combined with the SOSUS community to form the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, submarine adjacent. Almost half of the population that worked at the NAVFACs, the naval facilities, and the NOPFs, which are now the undersea warfare community, were women. And so today I'm wearing my warfare pin because at that point in time, my community was one of 2 communities in the Navy that did not go to sea and were afforded a warfare pin solely for the job that we did as part of this larger, broader anti-submarine warfare community. So I hope that gives you a little bit of background as to why this is really a passionate topic for me. And it's also one that brings, when we really think about the submarine community, one of the things that they all serve with this massive amount of pride. Because being a submariner is really hard. It's really difficult. And I remember I was so excited thinking about that. The repeal of the risk rule was coming, right? Even in the early 90s, there was this conversation about that it was coming. And I was telling my command master chief, my buddy Lydia Matthews, and I was, we want to go, we want to be on board a submarine, right? Because a couple of times we were fortunate enough to be able to go out for the day, right? When we'd have to come right back in. We couldn't be out more than, I think it was like 13 hours we couldn't be out. So they had to bring us back to port. And I was always so jealous because when I come back, I'm like, I want to do this so bad. But it just wasn't meant for me to some of us, right? But we took great pride in the fact that knowing that the work that we were doing, right, was of benefit to that community. And so when the community was opened in 2010 to women, it was this moment that for so many of us who had served in the submarine adjacent career fields, we celebrated so hard because we were thinking, we wish that could be us, but we're so happy that this new generation of young women are going to be able to have this experience. Because the one thing about the submarine community too is that those folks, if we think life aboard a surface ship is hard, folks don't have any clue as to what life aboard a submarine is hard. I mean, it is difficult, right? To know that you're going to be at sometimes under the water for 30 to 60 days at a time without seeing sunlight, without ever coming above the waterline, knowing that there's only certain ports around the world where you can make a port call, that you can pull in and actually have liberty. And knowing that your sole mission, right, is at the forefront of, for the SSBNs particularly, that you are one of those 3 parts of the U.S. nuclear triad, right? To know that you are the tip of the spear for part of America's nuclear security. So I think that understanding the value add to this, to use a very, very common parlance in the Navy vernacular these days, is the significant value add that this has created, because it was really difficult on the blue and gold teams that they were constantly rotating out, right? And so being able to have this additional crew, the additional crew members on board, because nuke school is hard, folks. It's not a cakewalk. So when you begin to have these additional people who could come through the nuke pipeline, graduate, and now staff your boats. Submarines are not called ships. They're referred to as boats. Right? It just made this resounding change in how the community could be staffed. So I am really super excited about the fact that all of the new Columbia classes are being built, right, with this whole idea of this integrated crew. And it's really a wonderful, it provides really wonderful insight. When you hear, Cobb Kogler saying, we're not female submariners, we're just submariners, right? There is no difference. We all have a mission and we all have a job to do. And currently, this is a resounding thing that we're hearing more and more, right? From the FET teams and the Lioness teams who participated in ground operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, to women now who are flying, female aviators who are flying F-18s in patrols in protection of maritime shipping in the Red Sea, to thinking about protection of this in the South China Sea. This community of women, with the exception of those very specialized career fields that still are working to be integrated, we see that the enhancement of the lethality of the force is significant, because nobody joins these positions because they have to. They do these positions because they want to. And I think that that's very significant. That's something that we need to bear in mind when we hear folks saying things like, women shouldn't be in combat positions. And when we think about the lethality, the value add that women have contributed to these units, it's significant. And I speaking from a personal experience to that end, my husband is a retired Army infantry officer. And he joined the Army at the same time that I joined the Navy. He served, enlisted first, and then he, as he says, he went to the dark side and commissioned. First he said, I had this chafing, right, to know that I was going to be commanding female troops. I just chafed at that thought. And he said, and then the more that I got acclimated, the more I embraced it, the more that I saw that they had what it took to do the job. And that, I think, is one of the most, the thing that we hear the most, right? It's that the women have the desire and the want to do the job. So if we can accomplish that mission, right, without having to make any concessions, then why not do this? And I think given the success in the submarine community of the integration of women on board, particularly the boomer class, as well as the fast attacks and the new classes of submarines being built solely for those integrated units, speaks significantly of the progress that how far we have come. Am I looking forward to the time that I see the first female skipper? Yes. Is it coming? Yes, very soon. I would be surprised if it doesn't happen sooner than later. I'm really excited to see the first female put on a star and be the commander of a submarine squadron. Absolutely. Is it coming? Yes, it is. Right. And again, I think it speaks to this notion that we're moving past this idea that there needs to be that integration can't happen with the genders, that it is absolutely, it has proved to be a success. Has it been easy? Absolutely not. Will it continue to be challenging? Yes. But what great things have we not accomplished that weren't just a little bit challenging, right? So if you look over the course of American history, some of the best things that we've ever done came out of challenging times, because we learned some very hard lessons, and then we try to move ourselves and our nation forward, and we are more than often the very better for it. So with that, I don't want to take up, like, I put my timer on for 30 minutes. I could go on all day about this, but I want to be very cognizant of your time. So what questions do you have for me?
Yep.
Are you still in the Navy or retired or what?
So when my rate went away in 1997, we knew at that point in time, by 1993, that the rate was going to go away. And because the risk rule, the combat exclusion policy, was still in full force and effect, there would be really no place for me to go, because the only other career field that I could very easily transfer into was the sonar tech. And that career field was very limited for women, very limited. there would have been absolutely very little promotion potential. The vast majority of the men that I served with if they were not already chiefs, E6s, by the time that the career field went away in 1997, when they transferred over, very few of them actually achieved any more promotion than that. The vast majority of the E5s that I served with went on to retire as E6s. Again, the promotion potential was very limited because the community was so saturated. So I made the decision to get out of the Navy. And at that point in time, it absolutely broke my heart. But it was just something that I felt like there was something on the outside that I could do to marry the two loves in my life at that point in time, which was one, history, and two, was to continue trying to do something to help the Navy to the best that I could, right? And that was to go into the business of being a military historian.
Are there any engineering females on submarines?
Yes. As a matter of fact, we have both officer and enlisted female engineers. There is a young second class machinist mate. I believe her name is M.M. Gonzalez. That she was one of the first women aboard the New Jersey, if I'm remembering correctly, to do her qualifications. And she's second in line to become the head of the enlisted head of the engine room. So I think, if I remember correctly, I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that she is like on track. So yeah, they're passing nuke school. The female enlisted are passing their qualifications. They're earning their dolphins. They're passing their qualifications for their stations on board the submarines. And not, so again, I think that we need to bear in mind that it's not that we need to say 100%, right? Because we're never going to get to 100%. There's always going to be the outliers, right? But what we can say is that it is the majority, right? So, but I think too, this speaks to the work that Admiral Gilday and Admiral Franchetti has put into the concept of mentoring, of readiness, resiliency, in professional development for our service members, that we look to our fellow crew members, right, our fellow service members, for that mentoring, that peer mentoring, to help move careers forward. So it's not that it's one-sided, it's dual-sided, but we do see more and more that this peer mentoring is succeeding, and that our folks are really developing and honing their skill sets that make our ships, our submarines, our aircraft, and everything in between, the seabed to space, right? Be more productive, better. Is it slow sometimes? Sure. Is it perfect? No. Are we moving the stick forward? Yes.
When I was on the USS Patrick Henry 599, a long time ago, it was full of young guys in their 20s. 25 was an old guy, honestly. So the libido of the mentality of the male chauvinist on board kind of spread throughout the ship, all the way up to the captain. Has that been taken under control lately because of the environment?
So I'm going to be very careful about how I answer this, okay? Because I am because I am speaking in my capacity as an official Navy historian. So, so the answer to that is yes. I think that we have made significant strides in not turning that off, right? And I think that we need to really think about the fact that instead of beating up on people, because that goes both ways, right? That in of itself, that construct that it can't go both ways, I think that's a little bit erroneous, right? So I think it's a matter of maturation and maturity with our crews. Is it always not a thing? Absolutely, it's a thing, right? But it's how we deal with it now. So instead of it being a laughing matter, we tried to do peer counseling and mentoring to say, hey, you know, this is your crew. This is your crewmate. This is your shipmate, right? And when push comes to shove, as you know, right, being on board a submarine, those are tight quarters, right? But at the end of the day, what is the mission and how do we accomplish the mission, right? That has to be at the forefront of everything that we do in preparing for, in being in that element of readiness, in being resilient, understanding where we are in that moment and building the EQ, right? To be able to recognize that moment and tell your fellow crewmate, not so sure what you did was appropriate there, right? On both ends of the spectrum. That has to be open lines of communication. There's still work that needs to be done, absolutely. But I think that we're making the positive strides forward.
Did you tour or get training at any facility that was building submarines in the U.S. here that would help you get some knowledge of what you're working with?
So, yes. But again, I'm gonna kind of defer that question a little bit. You know, we've had significant problems in our shipyards, as I'm sure you all are aware of. But in touring the facilities that are building the submarines, and I've only been able to have the privilege of doing one several years ago. It is quite a breathtaking undertaking to watch those boats be built. You know, it's really easy to go watch a surface ship being built. And to know that those boats, they're not going to be on top of the water, they're going to be under the water. And the love and care that's given to those submarines because they know that the crew members aboard, if there is one problem with a weld, one problem with a seam, that could mean it could risk that entire crew. So I hope that answers your question, but also understand that I'm trying to be very careful about how I couch my answers, because that is it's a really great thing to see. And I understand Wisconsin is being built, correct? Yes, and I'm sure everybody's really excited about that, and we are too. I mean, the Navy is ecstatic every time that we get a new boat being built. Like it's just this, yes, yeah. I mean, it's just kind of enthralling too, right? So, I would love nothing more than to go. She's being built at Groton, correct? Yes. So I haven't been to Groton I was there for the Rickover commissioning. But I would love nothing more than to go tour again and to kind of get my hands into the weeds on that and to see a little bit more about all of the great work that's being done in the construction of those boats.
On a more personal level, what was that like for you to get on that submarine the first time and here we go? Was that how long did it take before you kind of felt comfortable? Or did
I was so enthralled by the fact that I could do that, right? It's like the first time I climbed on a P3, I was so excited by that. But what was the moment that we submerged, I had this, right? It's kind of like, be careful for what you wish for. But the crew was great. You know, there was, you know, kind of some side eyes like, we got women on board, right? But they wanted to talk about what they did, and they wanted to share that with people who were in adjacent communities, right? Because falling under the larger umbrella of anti-submarine warfare, right? We were in that adjacent community, and they were excited to compare notes with us, right? For us to look at what they did and for us to talk about and have. So it was great, and the time slipped by so quickly. The thing I was most like, to be honest with you, the thing that gave me the biggest pause is who was it that was on board the Patrick Henry?
That's me.
Okay. Did you guys ever tie the string across the?
Oh,
the, yeah.
Watch the hall. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So I had this. So that was my biggest moment of trepidation is they did the string. Right. And as we began to descend, to dive, watching that string dip, I was like, oh, I'm going to suck up half the oxygen in this boat before we ever get out of here. Like, oh. But then you forget, right? I mean, and I acknowledge that was probably all of the adrenaline I was feeling. I was just so happy to be there, and it was over before it was over too quickly, right? And now I look at these young women, and I'm just like, you go, you go out and enjoy this, right? I mean, because it's still, to me, the way I still look at it, it's a very specialized community because not everybody can do it. I can tell you that the rate of failure is significant out of especially out of nuke school, and not once ever, and you can be in that community. And then all of a sudden you go do your first tour and you're like, I can't do this, right? I can't sleep in a coffin rack, and I can't do this 30, 60 day without sunlight thing and fresh air, right? And so I think that of itself speaks to the resiliency, the mental aptitude, the capabilities of these crews, right? To know that this is what your job is, and this is what we're asking you to do. And then again, to be willing to do this not once, but time and time and time again. That, when you talk to some of the older, master chiefs that have been doing this for quite some time, sometimes I'm thinking to myself, how did you, continue to do this? I mean, I have met master chiefs, and I have met, captains, 06s that they spent their entire careers. They wouldn't go to a shore duty unless they were absolutely forced to, that they would rather stay on board a boat. But I think that's just, it's just crazy, right? I mean, and it's crazy good, not crazy bad. Although crazy bad can be crazy good sometimes. But I think you have a little bit of that element, right, to be on board a boat, right, to be on board a submarine. But I think that how many of you are on LinkedIn? Are anybody on LinkedIn? So there, Lieutenant Commander Andrea Howard, I tried my best to reach out to her to get her to join us tonight. But if you see her, follow her on LinkedIn. She's on board the New Jersey. She is a rock star, just like Master Chief Kogler and somebody, the Lieutenant Commander Cowan and the others that I've talked about tonight, including your very own lieutenant. So follow these folks because they're doing really great work. And to really fully understand about the significance of having this moment, right, when we're seeing these very specialized crews work so synergized and so, just getting their job done it's fantastic, right? And it's a moment that speaks to the larger, even surface community. I've had conversations as of late with ships captains and crews who have come back from the Red Sea, and when I ask them about, would you trade being on board a surface ship to being on board a submarine? The answer is like, no. That's a very special kind of creature who goes down on board a submarine, right? So again, I think that whenever you see folks who volunteer for this community in particular, we really need to think about the fact that they're, again, as I said, they're volunteering. And it's very enheartening to see.
So what, I understand that you have a lot of training to go out into a boat. What happens when that training, and then you also have the stress of combat and something, they just can't do it, and they're under the water, so what happens then? And they can't port.
Are you talking about okay, so I think that I'm gonna use the I have to be kind of careful how I answer this question as well. I want to go back to the readiness and resiliency piece that I talked about earlier. What we're seeing is in the moments when someone might have a moment of trepidation, when they might have a moment like, I don't know if I can do this, right? The steps that the Navy has taken, particularly since 2016, to increase readiness, right? But more importantly, resilience. So that what we have are these great crews who, in that moment, when someone has that moment of trepidation, right? That moment of angst, they're talking to each other and they're assisting one another with processing what they're feeling, right? And then learning to work back to the place where they can be absolutely, they're confident back in their own skin again, right? Commanders are very engaged with their crews the vast majority of time. They know what's going on with people. They want to be talking to their crews. I mean, you can't, if you're the captain of an aircraft carrier, you can't talk to all 5,000 people on board that aircraft carrier at one time, right? So you have to rely on your divos and your LPOs to be engaging those folks for you. But on board a submarine, that's a very tight community. And again, whether it's a surface ship like a destroyer or a cruiser or a submarine, those crews they're mentoring and self-peering. And it is I think it speaks to what the Navy has done with regard to training and being prepared for those moments. And also I think that it speaks to the EQ of our sailors, right? From the deck plate to leadership, they are stepping up and recognizing that just because their crewmate had this moment of trepidation doesn't mean that they can't do it. It just means that because the human being in itself, we are all fallible, right? We can all experience that moment of self-doubt, right? Which causes us to not react. But whenever you have someone that tells you it's okay for you to feel this in this moment, but we're going to work back to a place where you feel confident, right? And we're seeing this happen. And I think this is a great course correct. Is it going to be perfect? No. Are we going to have instances where we have to have ships pull into port and have the crew member come off the boat, off of the ship? Sure. But as evidence in the past couple of years with instances that have occurred, we have seen, like I said, this element of readiness and resiliency really pay off. I would have to say that it has, if it's possible for something to improve 180% since I was on active duty, I'm going to say that. To me, it's 180 out of where I was when I was on active duty. And when I came back to DOD after teaching ROTC for a long time, it was one of those moments that it made me stand there and just be agape with how forward thinking some of these ideas are about what it means to be resilient. And sometimes I think that we need to choose a new word for it, that we've used that word too many times. I mean, look how many times I've used it in this conversation, right? But until we get a new word for it, that's just what it's going to have to be. but the crews are ready. And again, is it going to be perfect? No, but it never is, right? It's never going to be perfect. Do we want it to be? Absolutely. But in something like a case of combat, nothing is ever 100%. And we saw that during World War I. We saw that during World War II. We saw that in the Peloponnesian War. We see it, with current operations after World War II throughout. So there is that element of risk mitigation that commanders have to really think about. And how do you prepare? So the old adage, you prepare for the worst and be grateful for anything better that you get. So whenever you train for the worst case scenario, right, and you know that you're ready to go, even when that worst case scenario occurs, and even if someone has that moment where they're like, that their crewmates they're going to step into the breach, right? And then on the backside of that, they're not going to ostracize their crewmate. They're going to work with them. I can't say enough about that. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
How many are on the crew of a submarine?
I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't hear you.
How many are on the crew?
It depends on which boat, which type of boat it is. I think currently with the new Columbia class, I think there's going to be 130. Does that sound? I think that's about right.
Yeah.
And of course, the bigger the boat, typically, the larger the crew that you have. But that's something that we also don't do a lot of times. We don't do finite numbers on. Just because, right? So, I mean, the accommodations, because how many of you know that on board submarines too, they hot rack? Was that the gentleman who was on board the Patrick Henry? Do you guys know what hot racking is?
No.
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
On the submarine here.
Yeah, I mean, so which submarine do you guys have there?
The cobia.
The USS Cobia, so it's like Gato class.
Gato class. So when you go down and look at those racks, right, those sleeping berths, so people share them. So because a lot of times now so I'm going to speak from the Cold War perspective. You'd work 12 on, 12 off on board a submarine. If I remember correctly, if somebody knows that I'm like wrong in this, please correct me. But so while one crewmate was sleeping, the other one would be working, and then as one, you change that over, so that's hot racking. You basically are sharing a rack. And if you've ever looked at those berthing, I mean, if you're 6 foot tall, are you going to be stretched out in that? Right. So there was this other thing too, that for a long time, when I first went on board a submarine, the XO of the boat looked at me and he said, "You're the perfect height." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "How tall are you?" I said, 5'6". He said, "That's great. That's perfect. We don't really want submariners who are like over 5'10". And I'm like, "Why?" It's like, go through a step through some of the hallways in here. And then I'm like, "Oh yeah." Cause man, banging, going up and down the ladders. So I was fortunate enough to go on board a destroyer recently, and I was going up ladder. Right. And I thought to myself, I am old, because I don't remember it being this hard. Right. It was, they go like this, and I'm like, ugh. And of course, whenever you feel like you're a little bit old too, you're just always like, am I going to hurt myself, fracture a hip or something, and then you're just kind of like, oh, all worried, but it was energizing really being aboard those ships with the young crews and stuff, because they're like, "Hey ma'am, you need a hand down." And I'm like, "Don't call me ma'am." So I mean, it's just it's so inspiring, but I don't know, to be honest with you, as much as I love the community, I'm not sure if somebody invited me to go for a 3-day Tiger cruise that I'd be like, "Sure, let's do this." Right. I might be like, can we go back out for 12 hours again?
I think we had a question in the back.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about modern submarines being at the tip of the spear of America's nuclear capabilities. I'm going to ask you another resiliency question here, but how do you even prepare a modern submariner for that kind of responsibility? It's such an incredible is that like always on their minds, or is that just part of the job?
That's a good question. So again, I'm going to be very careful about how I answer this. When you know that you hold those capabilities, right, that you're on board a craft, whether it's an aircraft, whether it's a destroyer, whether it's a submarine, whether you're, sitting in a silo somewhere with the Air Force, on a B-52, whatever the case may be, that is some serious EQ that crew has to have. Because is that something that we want to do? No, absolutely not. But the one thing that submarines do is they, again, that point of the spear kind of thing is deterrence. A submarine in many ways is a force multiplier because you don't know where they're at. You're not always real sure about their capabilities unless you were absolutely sure which boat, which hull, which type. And even then, there's always a surprise, right? You just never know. So, years ago during the Cold War, there was always the threat that a Soviet submarine, an SSBN, was sitting off the coast of the United States, whether it was the Pacific or the Atlantic. And knowing that those submarines, the SSBNs, carried enough weaponry on board to do some serious damage to the Eastern Seaboard or the Western Seaboard, or even into the heartland of the United States. And then we got to a point where those submarines didn't even have to leave Murmansk or Petropavlovsk in order to fire their weapons. And neither did ours, right? So we could sit in port and do the exact same thing. So could the Brits. That's a scary world indeed, right? To be thinking about the fact, so you can see an airplane for the most part, unless it has stealth technology. And then, which we're all aware of, the B-2s and stuff that were utilized. But when you don't always know where a submarine is, and that is on purpose. Their mission is so complex, and remaining in that those crews they have to stay ready, right? And part of that readiness is being able to recognize when you're having a moment, and also looking towards the resiliency factor, having folks to talk to, right? Whenever you turn around, if you're on a gold crew, you come back, you come off the submarine, the blue crew's taking it out, you got 90 to 120 days, you get some downtime. Being able to take advantage of the things that the Navy now offers to help the decompression point post those deployments. They really helps those crew to stay at their top peak of performance. And part of that is understanding what their mission is. Does anybody ever want to have that happen again? Absolutely not. But they understand what their mission is. And again, they're volunteers, right? The submarine community, that's a volunteer.
So I have a two-part question, and one has to deal with episodes like Tailhook from back in 1991. Is that type of thing still going on?
Tailhook was a momentous turning point for the United States Navy. As a female veteran who served during the fallout of Tailhook and lived through some of the very dark times for females in the services after Tailhook, I can't tell you 100% that episodes, very condensed, very small, do not happen. But whenever those episodes do happen, they are dealt with immediately. And is it perfect? No. We can never expect anything to be perfect because human beings themselves, we're not perfect. But understanding that was a significant turning point for the Navy. That was a lot of crow to eat, so to speak. And that presented a problem and a challenge. And I think that leadership at that point in time, now historians have to be very mindful that we are to never judge the past through the lens of the present. So when someone asks me that question and they say, I can't find the rah-rah of anything that the Navy did with it, I'm like, okay, so as a female who was on active duty during that time frame, I can tell you that there's some rah-rah moments afterwards. Was it slow? Sure. Was it painful? Absolutely. Has there been positive steps made? Yes, ma'am. And again, we can't always rule that out. You're always going to hear the bad things, oftentimes more than you hear the good things, right? Going back to the turn of the 20th century with with the Hearst family, the Hearst newspapers, conceptualizing this thing called blood leads and the selling of newspapers and that has rolled over into press and other things that that's typically what we hear are these bad stories first and get the bad news first and not the good news. So for every one instance bad thing that you hear occur, there's 100 good things that you're not hearing. And I think that's a shame. That really is sad that as a society, we tend to, you open up the news apps or, you watch TV or whatever, and it's bad news, right? So looking towards those good news things. And as I said, Tailhook was a turning point.
But the other thing I wanted to mention is, if you've ever been to the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, now that has to do more with the Air Force, but they had women pilots, and they talked about what an important role they played during the wars in the Mideast, because they could relate to the women who were in those little villages, and that made such a difference.
So during Iraq and Afghanistan, as I think I mentioned before, the Lioness and the FET teams, FET means a female engagement teams, were sent forward, even sometimes with special forces, to engage the female population that those specialized male-dominated units were not able to engage with because of cultural constructs, right? The men couldn't talk to those women. So the Lioness and the FET teams were instrumental in opening lines of communication with women in villages, homes, areas that had typically been, that they wouldn't have that connected tissue with, right? Well, I'll get it out in a minute. But what we saw in those moments, right, with those teams is the fact that female combat units, having females embedded in those combat units, they brought a significantly new skill set to the conversation, right? And learning some of those lessons learned coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we've brought that forward. And I would hope, and I can tell you that after 20 years of continuous operations, from GWAT to ongoing contingency operations, now into Operation Inherent Resolve, that the whole transition coming out of 2001, when some of the first people on the ground in Iraq were women who were in National Guard units. I had a student that I taught. She was with a unit that was one of the first ones on the ground before the Green Zone even existed. She talked about how her unit and the trucks that they were in essentially did the old-fashioned kind of wagon wheel, right? They circled the wagons, and their safe space, their green zone, was inside that circle. And technically, it was not a green zone because they were getting shot at and fired at. So I think that when we think about the contribution, right, And of course, let's go back to those early days too. I'm sure you guys remember Jessica Lynch, right? When she was taken and a Navy SEAL team rescued her. I had the privilege of interviewing her, and she had a lot to say about that. And did she think that she didn't belong? No, she thought that she had a job to do. I mean, her friend Lorianne Pastrana gave her life as a result of that convoy getting attacked. But those lessons that we've learned, we've brought forward, right? And one of those things, when we see this evolution of the combat risk rule, the combat exclusion policy, the risk rule getting pulled back, is because of this contribution that the land forces had been able to really develop and integrate that synergy into their forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then you talk about the female aviators, right? So let's go with the female aviators. Their role a lot of times always has been like just negated, right? That they're flying F-14 or F-18s, they're flying the Growlers, they're flying the C-130s, they're flying the C-7. I mean, every airframe out there, and you rarely ever hear that conversation unless something really special happens. Like, when an F-18 Growler pilot happens to do something that's not been done before, right? So are there firsts? Yeah. Are you going to continue to have them? Yeah. But what I constantly hear from women, and again, I had the privilege of having FET team members. I had 2 FET team students that I taught in ROTC, and they talked about how the whole premise that they were different because they were women began to diminish. The pilots that I've talked to, the female aviators that I've talked to, both in the Air Force and in the Navy, they talk about how significant that is, that they just want to be considered an aviator, right? Because they're doing the same job. They're doing it to the qualifications that were standardized before women were allowed. And that there's while it is very significant that we do have these firsts, one common theme that I've heard is that eventually we'll get to the point where we're not having this when the final glass ceiling is shattered, right? And that's what they're looking for. They're looking towards that moment when we can say that there's no more firsts because we've done all of them. Right. And that's across the board. That's not just for women. That's also for men too. Right. That is for everyone. So I think that, again, if we're talking about the successes of the FET teams and the Lioness teams, and I wrote my dissertation on this, is the integration of women into these units harkens back to the days of World War II, when women, not in the U.S. forces, but women in the Soviet forces, were integral parts of combat units. One of the most highly decorated Russian snipers ever was a female. Their top 5, out of their top 5 snipers, 3 were female. You don't hear that, right? You don't hear that part of it, because immediately after the war, they were discharged. Don't want to talk about that. The IDF itself, the Israeli Defense Force, one of the first fully integrated defense forces, both male and female, women and men in the IDF have to serve. And Germany is started like reconsideration of having that not draft, but the registration for all young men and women. There's a consideration for young women for the Bundes. And I know that as of late, there has been discussion about should women be included in the draft. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole with that one. But this is what I will say. From a historian's perspective, knowing that since the beginning of time, women have been involved in, contributed to, and have been successful leaders in different societies around the world. And knowing what we are capable of in doing now, what the service branches are doing now, I don't really see a reason for us to not to really engage in that conversation. That's a serious conversation that really needs to be had. And we need to re-engage in it and really think about it, because if we're really thinking about this integration as being a great thing, then what is one of the last hurdles that we need to overcome besides the specialized warfare units? It's that topic. And for people to say, my dad and all of his infinite wisdom sometimes, and I love it. I loved him to pieces, right? So I asked him one afternoon, I said, would you feel different had I been drafted? Knowing that I'm your oldest child, would you feel different about it? He said, you volunteered. So what difference would it have made? I said, but how would you have felt? And he said, I don't know. He said, but honestly, what makes you any different than your papa who was drafted during World War II? And I said, I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. And I know that families, everyone has entitled to have their own beliefs and opinions with regard to that. But at the same time, if young women are wanting to serve, then why should we stand in their way? And as much as families say, I don't want my daughter drafted, families also say, I don't want my son drafted. So it's an honest question, and it's a real question. It's a real conversation that we need to continue to have.
Thank you.
I think we have a question online, and that will be our last question.
Yeah, there's one question from our online audience. You mentioned a little bit about other nations that had integrated militaries. Are there any others that have specifically started or have integrated their submarine forces that we know of?
I will have to double check on that. I think so. I think at one point in time, Great Britain had been discussing that. But I will also say this. The United States still maintains one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. And the United States, along with her allied partner nations, now with the AUKUS agreement, are building an even larger fleet. Other than the Chinese, currently, we've not even seen a reinvigoration of the Russian submarine building program, with the exception of a couple of hulls. Given, I think, this expansion, let me go back a minute. Can you ask me the question again, please? I kind of went down a rabbit hole with my line of thinking.
Yeah, like basically that we know of. Are there other nations around the world that might have already integrated their submarine service, or that we know of?
So as far as to the best of my knowledge, and it's been quite a couple of years since it's been a couple of years since I really delved into that. I think ours is the first fully integrated. Because, to be fair, historically, a lot of other nations follow what we do, right? And the successes that we have. So if we can make it work, can they make it work?
Thank you.
But again, us also having the largest fleet, we have more of an opportunity to do that.
One more? Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you for your service and what you contributed to our servicemen and everybody here. Thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you.
It has been my pleasure, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you so much for your time. If any of you have any follow-on questions, please don't hesitate to have Caroline reach out. And know that once our new museum is up and running here in DC, we would love to see all of you here to see what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Lori.
You're welcome. And I would love to be there. I'd love to be with you guys whenever the new Wisconsin is when she comes to life.
Yeah. And thank you to all of you. If you enjoyed this program, we do have a couple of exciting events coming up. This Saturday, we have our annual Christmas tree ship day, which is our free day. So Santa is going to be bringing some Christmas trees by tugboat. That's going to be happening at 10:30. And yeah, it's going to be running from 10 to 4. So lots of exciting things then. And then the continuation of Think and Drink on January 2nd with the first talk in the ICE series is going to be happening. And that is going to be on the history of ice boating, which is very exciting because we're also going to have a bit of an exhibit opening about ice boating as well. So very fun. I would just like to say one last thing, which is that this is actually my last Think and Drink. I'm moving on to different opportunities. This will not be the last Think and Drink. We have a lot of capable people that are going to bring it along, and it is going to continue to thrive. But I really appreciate all of you coming out month after month. It really means a lot to me, and thank you for helping this program thrive. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Caroline. So I have one thing, if you don't mind. My colleague, Dr. Heather Haley, just messaged me and said Korea is the other country that has fully integrated their female submarine force. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. And some other nations are also like Argentina, Australia, Canada, Denmark, Netherlands, and others are moving towards that. So thank you, Dr. Haley, for assisting me with that answer. You guys, I've had a wonderful time. Thank you so much again, and hope to see you again.